So there should be no surprise to anyone that we now have vaccine companies that are, or potential vaccines that will, in fact, be manufactured here in Canada. In fact, my own premier, Brian Pallister, take a look at Newswatch. You look at Newswatch, and he's acquired some vaccine, a commitment for vaccine. Ottawa hasn't prevented provinces from being able to acquire. If they feel that they want to be able to acquire vaccines too, they can do that. Premier Brian Pallister has actually acquired a commitment from a vaccine company.
Why become a member? Well, the General gives you all kinds of footage you can't see anywhere else, not for the general public. Now we have the Generous, where you get all the emojis, all the same stuff, plus you get it also a shout out once a month. And then we have the Donors. Now the Donors every month will have a video of their own choosing and their call, and they keep this station going. So that's why we say you should join. The General will give you all kinds of content that we can't show. And comments are wide open for members, content only.
We go now to Ms. Sadu. Ms. Sadu, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like I said earlier, this is an always evolving situation. It is evolving even now. Since we started this discussion a few hours ago, Prime Minister made an important announcement. He announced that Pfizer would be delivering millions more doses in the spring. Deliveries that had been scheduled for the last quarter of the year are being moved up, so we will receive even more in the summer months. Prime Minister also said we'll soon share the schedule with the provinces and territories so they can prepare to get all those doses into people's arms. He also announced he would receive an additional 4 million doses from Moderna and 9 million doses of Pfizer, which would arrive over the summer. So we are now on track to receive 84 million doses by the end of September from just these two manufacturers, Pfizer and Moderna. Another point, Mr. Chair, I want to make, there's the big difference with the other countries and Canada is that they had a domestic capacity before the pandemic. This is to echo Dr. Pawlowski's point about pharmaceutical manufacturers repeatedly pulling out of Canada on the Conservatives' watch. Remember that New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan have barely even started vaccinating countries with the at-home industry. What are we doing about it? Mr. Chair, Minister Champagne announced on Tuesday, Canada has reached an agreement in principle with Novavax, attracting that leading developer to manufacture their vaccine at the expanded Royal Mount facility, potentially starting in late 2021. The point is this, Mr. Chair, not only has our government have been able to adapt to this ever-changing situation, is doing so, we are reversing the trend of manufacturer leaving Canada and rebuilding our own capacity to sustain ourselves. All Canadian vaccine developers supported by our government are making progress through their clinical trials and medical launching phase, I think 2 or 3 trials in November. So this is all the good work happening, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dew. We go now to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, just a couple of things. Interestingly, Ms. Sadu just commented on this figure of the Prime Minister announcing we're going to get 80 million doses. I noticed she said by the end of September. So again, this is part of this confusion I have about whether it's by September or by the end of September, and this increasingly ever-changing target. It's hard to get clear communications from this government, and I think clarity is very important to Canadians in a time of crisis. What's interesting, a point I wanted to make in terms of scaring off these pharmaceutical companies, one thing that we all have to remember is the money that went into developing these vaccines, by and large, was public. In fact, if I understand correctly, Moderna was 100% funded by United States taxpayers. This is not a question of these pharmaceutical companies who have spent billions of dollars of their own money and spent years on their own and taking risks to develop these vaccines so that they have an expectation of private development and hoarding of the technology and information. These vaccines were developed through public dollars by and large. We're not talking about hypertension drugs or baldness cures or any of the private, where you could legitimately argue that these pharmaceutical companies legitimately, develop these on their own, and so they have a right to control this. We have a worldwide pandemic, and I'm hearing Liberals talk about the private pharmaceutical development model standing in the way, standing as basically a boulder in the stream to the development, as the whole world breathlessly waits for more vaccines, and we're waiting to see if Pfizer, Moderna, or AstraZeneca can produce enough. I know that some of my colleagues on this committee and I have had a lot of talks about the concept of compulsory licensing, which is exactly what should be used in this situation. Compulsory licensing means this: when a private patent holder has the patent to a life-saving medication and they are either unwilling or unable to make that medication available and life or death is on the line, governments have the right to act on those patents. And so here we are talking about the normal right of expectation of a couple of pharmaceutical companies who might get mad at us if we reveal the contracts they signed, when we reveal the contracts to produce life-saving medication that the whole world needs that we paid for. That's a shocking abdication of public responsibility. If this government did negotiate such a right with these companies, I think Canadians have a right to know that. And I think Dr. Pawlowski overstated my brilliance on this maybe, but I will reiterate, let's see the confidentiality clauses then. Let's see exactly what this government agreed to. Now, in terms of, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just have to, in terms of, if we're playing the blame game, the Conservatives did, in my view, make a terrible mistake in privatizing Connaught Labs in 1986, and they deserve every legitimate criticism that can be leveled against that. Connaught Labs for decades had provided cheap insulin to Canadians. And by the way, I'm going to stop for a moment and note that here we are at the 100th anniversary in 2021 of the Canadian discovery of insulin in this country at the U of T by Dr. Banting and Best. And I want to throw some thanks to my colleague Sonia Sidhu for her championing of the diabetes strategy. And that was Connaught Labs that made sure that they honored Dr. Banting's and Best objective to make insulin available, not for private profit, but as a discovery for the world. It saved millions of lives by allowing diabetics to get access to cheap insulin. They also, by the way, Connaught Labs played a role in vaccination. I believe it's of diphtheria. And, Dr. Pawlowski's a doctor, so I'm not going to go further because he'll know what the other diseases were. And this was a public manufacturer. So what a colossal policy failure for the Conservatives to privatize that and begin the process of leaving Canada in the position that we never should have been in to this day, which is that we don't have domestic capacity as a G7 country to produce life-saving vaccines and medications. Now, I'm going to turn my attention to Liberals because they play their role in this too. Since 1986, by my counting, Liberals have been in power 19 years, 13 of that in majority government, 7 terms. And what did they do? Did they bring back a public drug manufacturer? No. Did they do anything to change that neoliberal course of pharmaceutical policy that was set in motion by the Mulroney government, where we gave them longer patents to pharmaceutical companies? We signed trade deals that protected globally pharmaceutical profits. The Liberals, they won't even go ahead and implement their own PMPRB reforms that they know is the right thing to do, and they've backed off 3 times because of big pharma pressure. There has been zero change by this Liberal government since 1986 to address the problematic situation that the Mulroney government put us into. So I don't think it lies in the mouths of any Liberals to point fingers at Conservatives. A pox on both the Conservative and Liberals for this position. 150 years, these two parties have been in power in this country, and here we are in 2021, and we don't have the ability to produce a life-saving vaccine. And you know who does? Argentina, Mexico, India, Australia, Japan. These are countries. Argentina was an economic basket case 10 years ago. And we're a member of the G7, the most exclusive economic club on earth, one of the wealthiest nations on earth, one of the best societies on earth. And our successive federal governments have let us get into this position. Frankly, that's a shameful abdication of responsibility that both Conservative and Liberals owe an explanation to the Canadian public for. Now, I think that's all that I wanted to say at this point. My final, I guess, conclusion on this will be nobody wants to see vaccine production or distribution delayed or interrupted. But again, I don't think that by having us see delivery schedules and some basic provisions of the contracts that this government has signed on behalf of Canadians is going to do that. And instead, there are also, I'm not hearing any real response to the governance value of transparency. You know, again, at one time, this government really believed in that. In fact, they used that as a significant wedge issue to convince Canadians as to why they should reject the previous Conservative government, because they made a pledge to be more transparent. Again, by default, we shouldn't have to explain why we want transparency, because Mr. Trudeau said it's an expectation. And if the only argument I'm hearing from this government is, oh my goodness, the big bad pharmaceutical companies might not give us our doses of vaccine if we reveal redacted contracts to Canadians, then A, I'm going to say those contracts were horrifically negotiated. And B, I would say, then you know what you tell those big pharmaceutical companies? You tell them we'll compulsory license them and we'll produce those vaccine doses here in Canada. And you know why? Because I'll tell you what's more important than big pharmaceutical profits and interests: the health and lives of Canadians. That trumps privacy and private profit. And quite honestly, where I'm going to conclude is, because we haven't talked about this in this committee either, I still have not received a real answer from this government why Canada is opposing India and South Africa and Brazil's request to the WTO to temporarily relax TRIPS rules to make this technology and intellectual property available for the entire world to start producing, so we can unleash the massive ability of the Indian and Brazilian pharmaceutical industries to produce vaccines by the billions, but they just don't have the technology and IP. Why are we continuing to use a private sector drug development model in the context of a global pandemic, where we know that to do so is the whole world is waiting for these private companies to ramp up production? Why are we restricting production just to them? Why aren't we busting open the industrial capacity of the entire world to produce vaccines? And lest you think this is only an issue of economics, it's not. I'm going to conclude by saying this. This is a global virus. We just passed a motion to this committee earlier today to study variants, dangerous variants that if this virus mutates, it could render the vaccines that we have less effective or even completely ineffective. So you know what? Making sure that high-risk individuals in every country of the world are vaccinated is not just a question of morality. It's a question of self-interest. Because all it takes is one person from Cameroon to hop on a plane and fly to Toronto and get off with a dangerous new variant, to be a super spreader and globally infect and introduce a dangerous variant into Canada for which our vaccines that we have may be less or even not effective against. And so I think these are questions that we better, and I want to hear from my Liberal colleagues as to why, whether they support their Liberal government's opposition at the WTO to making the global COVID vaccines widely available, or do they agree that this is really the private preserve of the Pfizers and Modernas and AstraZenecas of the world? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. So Mr. Killaway is up next, but what I'm going to propose right now is, since we've been at this for 3 hours, that we suspend for a few minutes and let the committee staff take a bit of a break, perhaps a bio break, and I suspect we could all use a bit of a break. So is there any opposition to suspending for 10 minutes?
For 10 minutes.
Yep. No opposition? No. Very well, we will suspend for
testimony today.
Looking at shutting down the meeting, Mr. Polyev, so if you could...
All right. If we see the contracts, we will know what we got into, we will get answers, and we will be able to move forward. I don't see this as a way of hammering away at anyone or anything. It's simply a matter of reassuring Canadians. If there's no information, well, people's imaginations are going to fill the void. And this might lead to conspiracy theories or other such things. All we are asking for is clear, honest, frank, and direct answers. And this way we will be able to reassure Canadians and calm them down. This is why, if we see the contracts, everybody, regardless of political party, everybody will be in a situation to do a better job, and we as MPs will be able to better work for our constituents. There's no point in hiding this information. So it's just like a financial advisor who presents a good plan so that a person can retire well. And so I'm drawing a parallel between that situation and the vaccines against COVID. Thank you.